Hello, my name is Andres, and I want to share with you this story that, in my years as an embalmer, has been the most disturbing of all. I was only a few years into this profession when something happened in my old city that made me question whether I should continue in this challenging line of work. Although it's true that we are trained for these types of jobs to avoid becoming too affected or suggestible by what we see, we are still human, and there are things that are just too intense or unsettling, things that can certainly impact you, especially at that point in my life when I didn't have much experience. I was working with my colleague who had more years in the field than I did. We always worked together, but that night, she asked for permission to leave early because it was her eldest son's graduation, precisely that night. That night, a body arrived from the morgue, already prepared for embalming. But there was a catch. It was a young man who had no eyes. His eyes had been completely removed, and his family requested that I sew shut what remained of his eyelids. Although I had seen bodies in terrible condition due to accidents, I had never encountered someone without eyes, and the way they had been ripped out was particularly grotesque. Then, my boss gave me the family's instructions and added that the young man himself had removed his eyes because he no longer wanted to see all the terrifying things that visited him at night, according to what his mother said before he died. The atmosphere became very eerie and I started to feel chills. Believe me when I say the vibe in the room changed completely, a very negative and heavy energy. I was left entirely alone that night after my boss left, and I had to have the body ready by the next day when the family would arrive to hold the wake. I imagined that perhaps the young man suffered from a severe mental illness and that's why he saw things, but everything was about to take a very dark turn. I began working on the body, trying to hurry so I could leave as soon as possible because I felt uncomfortable, especially being alone with that body. I was in the middle of sewing the eyelids when suddenly the body moved. Although this sometimes happens because of gases that the body releases, this wasn't like that. It was as if the body had tried to sit up. I was seriously startled and began to sweat cold, but I continued my work. A few minutes after this happened, there was a sudden blackout. I was left completely in the dark in the room because there were no windows to the outside. It took me a while to find my phone because it was charging on the floor. So, stumbling over everything, I went to get it to turn on the flashlight. But as I was reaching for it, I heard something that sounded like the table where the bodies are placed being dragged. The adrenaline in me was through the roof at that moment. When I finally grabbed my phone, the power suddenly came back on, and I felt a wave of relief. But it was short-lived because when I looked at the young man's body, one of his eyelids was unstitched. I was completely shocked and tried to find some logical explanation. I thought maybe I hadn't sewn it well because I was nervous at the time, but at the same time, even though that was a possibility, it seemed like too much of a coincidence that it happened just when the lights went out for no apparent reason, and the stitching couldn't have come undone that quickly. At that point, I was utterly terrified. I called a friend who studied with me because I wanted to tell him what was happening, and at the same time, I wanted to talk to someone to feel less alone while finishing up with that young man's body. He calmed me down and helped me regain my composure. He reminded me not to let myself get carried away and that everything that had happened could have been a coincidence. So, I finally finished my work and went home. The next day, I returned to the funeral home in the afternoon to start my shift again, and they were already holding the wake for that young man. I felt relieved that it was all over, but when I entered the embalming room, my colleague was already there, and she asked me how it went with the body the previous night, with a curious look on her face. I asked her why she was asking, if she knew something, or why she was so curious. That's when she told me that when the young man's grandmother arrived, she spoke with her and the owner because she wanted her grandson's body to be cremated as soon as possible. She was desperate to have it done before her daughter, the young man's mother, arrived, but the owner told her that she couldn't do that without the mother's authorization. In her desperation, the grandmother told her that the boy had died because of his mother, who was a witch, and practiced many rituals at home with other women who did the same. She never loved her son, and because of the things she did, her son lived in hell by her side. He told his grandmother that at night, evil beings with terrifying shapes would visit him in his room. He said they were demons that his mother had summoned, and that in his final days, He had escaped from his home and gone straight to his grandmother's house, asking for refuge and protection. He had heard that his mother planned to offer him as a sacrifice that very night, in exchange for wealth because he was the most valuable thing she had to offer. The grandmother said she was deeply regretful because she didn't believe the boy, even knowing what her daughter was capable of. She decided to send him back home because she was too afraid of her daughter and didn't want any trouble with her. And that night was when the young man did what he did. He ended his life by gouging out his own eyes, so he would no longer see what terrified him so much. The grandmother said they needed to cremate him before his mother arrived, because she knew that the mother would do anything to steal his body and finish what she had started. Of course, the owner didn't allow it, as she could get into legal trouble, and the young man's grandmother left the funeral home in tears. I was left speechless listening to all of this, and after she finished telling me, I shared everything that had happened with that young man the night before. We both stood there in silence, filled with fear and uncertainty, and although I felt deep sorrow for the young man's tragic story, the last thing I wanted was to get involved in any of that, especially with that terrifying woman. Even so, there was nothing we could do, as legally the mother had the right, and her decision was to have him buried, not cremated. I never found out what happened with the young man's body after that, but the bitter and sad experience stayed with me, making me question whether I should continue working as an embalmer. As I said before, we are still human, and we often feel fear in cases like this. In the end, I didn't quit. I continued working, and now I've been doing this for 20 years. Yes, I've seen many grotesque and very sad things, but nothing as chilling as what happened with that young man and his horrible end. Hello, community. I want to share this story anonymously about something that happened to me in the United States a few years ago when I was already working as an embalmer at a funeral home that served low-income families. The funeral home was small with very few staff, but there was a lot of work since almost every day there were funerals. Consequently, I had a lot of work. Sometimes, I didn't have enough time to embalm all the bodies that accumulated and had to stay late at night, remaining there with only the janitor, who stayed to clean the funeral home to make sure it was ready for the following day's funerals. I would finish my work and leave the bodies ready so that the next day they could be laid out for viewing. Everything was practically normal, a routine for me, until Don Jorge, the janitor who had been there since I started working, who by the way is also Mexican, fell ill and requested his retirement as he had completed the years of service required to retire. Afterward, a new janitor was hired. He wasn't that old, probably in his 50s, and he was American. He barely talked to anyone, had a strange appearance, but that wasn't my problem. After all, I was just doing my job and didn't interact much with the people there since I never had time. One day, I remember arriving at the funeral home, and the owner was already very upset. He called me into his office, and once there, he told me that the family of a deceased person I had prepared for that morning was furious. When they removed his shoes to put on his favorite sneakers, his father noticed that 3 toes were missing. How was that possible when the young man had died from an illness, but his body was intact when it arrived at the funeral home? Indeed, the young man had his body intact. No part of his body was missing when I received him, so I was as puzzled as the owner and the family. I didn't know how to prove that I had left him intact and didn't know what had happened. Moreover, when I looked at the body again, the toes didn't have clean cuts. They looked as if they had been torn off. It was something so grotesque and terrifying that, of course, the young man's family filed a lawsuit against the funeral home. However, they couldn't prove anything since there were no security cameras in the embalming room, only in the hallways. After this incident, the owner decided to install a hidden camera in that same room, but didn't tell anyone on the staff. His goal was to catch whoever had done it if it happened again. I continued working as usual. A couple of weeks passed, and I remember that one night I also stayed late embalming and preparing the body of an elderly woman. When I finished the work and left, only the new janitor was there. I remember seeing him mopping the funeral parlor, and after that I went home. The next day I saw patrol cars at the place. I walked in feeling a bit scared as I didn't know what was happening. I entered the building and the first thing I saw was that man, the janitor, handcuffed. A few minutes later, they took him away in the patrol car. I asked my boss, with whom I had also developed a friendship by then, why they had taken the janitor away. That's when he took me to his office and showed me that grotesque recording. The same man, an hour after I had gone home, could be seen entering the room where the deceased woman was, and he was seen tearing off her toes with his teeth, eating them with an inhuman desperation. The scene was so disturbing that the police prohibited the funeral home owner from making it public or showing it to anyone else. They took the tape, but the owner kept a copy, I imagine, to protect himself from lawsuits or something. But the most disturbing part was when we later found out that this man had already worked in other states at different morgues, doing the same thing to bodies that no one would claim. He was eventually caught and spent several years in prison, but upon release he changed his identity, which is why the owner found nothing wrong in his background before hiring him. Maybe you were expecting a paranormal story, but to be honest, I find it much scarier that things like this happen. There are many sick people out there doing these kinds of things. I feel the need to share with people the horrors I experienced in that funeral home. My name is Eduardo, and I have been an embalmer for 10 years. Just last month I celebrated my 10th anniversary, but this happened 9 years ago when I was still new to the job. At that time it was very difficult for me to find work until a friend told me about an acquaintance of her mother who owned a funeral home and morgue right next to her house. It was a family business, and they might need help. She gave me the contact information of the owner, and I reached out to him almost immediately. He agreed to an interview, and I showed up at his business the next day. The interview went very well, and I was hired because they needed personnel. He was a man in his 60s, very kind and cordial, and his father had been the one who founded the business. When I started working there, I met the other employees, who were almost all family members. The forensic doctor who worked there was the owner's best friend, so everyone knew each other well. I was the only outsider, so to speak, but at first everything was very pleasant because everyone was friendly and respectful. However, very soon, things began to take a dark turn. I often stayed late because there were only 2 embalmers, me and the owner's son, who always left early, so I had to stay and finish the work when necessary. First of all, I want to explain that the funeral home was, of course, on the first floor, and the morgue where we embalmed the bodies was in the basement, which was set up, of course, to work comfortably. It was a spacious place, although sometimes I did feel quite confined down there. But that wasn't what started making me uncomfortable. It was when I stayed alone late at night that I began to hear things. Right there in the basement, I would hear bangs coming from where they kept the bodies in the cold rooms, and many times I would go to check, but there was never anyone there. The funeral home was closed when this happened, so I was alone. Many times I tried not to let my imagination get the best of me, although it got to the point where I even heard voices, more like moans, coming from that same room, which sent chills all over my body, forcing me to play music very loudly so I wouldn't hear anything anymore. You might ask why I didn't just leave. Well, I couldn't because I had to finish my work. The bodies had to be ready for viewing, or else I would certainly be fired. I couldn't leave my work half done. I never understood why I heard all those things until one night when I found out what they were doing there. That night, I finished my work on time, so I left early, around 8 p.m. I said goodbye to the owner's son, who was still there and left but almost home. I realized I had forgotten my phone charger. I had left it plugged into the wall, and I only had 10% battery left. So, despite feeling really lazy, I decided to go back for it. I had a copy of the key to access the basement directly without having to go through the funeral home. There were stairs at the back that led directly there, making it easier for morgue employees to enter and exit, so I went straight in. I should mention that there were no funerals that night, so the funeral home was closed. Upon entering the basement, there was a long hallway, and the second to last room was where I worked, where the bodies were embalmed and prepared. The last room at the end of the hall was where the forensic doctor worked, and where the cold rooms were located. Immediately after entering, I noticed everything was dark, but I could hear noises coming from the forensic doctor's room. I heard male voices, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. I didn't want to turn on the hallway light because it felt very strange and I had a bad feeling, like when your sixth sense activates to warn you that you're in danger, something like that. So, I decided not to turn on the light so they wouldn't realize I was there. I walked to the room where I worked to get my charger, using only the dim light coming from the window of the last room. I quietly entered and grabbed my charger, but before I could leave the room, I started hearing those strange people almost shouting. I swear it was sinister to listen to. I knew nothing good was happening in there. I stayed put because I wanted to find out what they were doing, but I was also very scared that if I left, they might hear me. I had no idea how much time passed, but suddenly they stopped talking, and I clearly heard the owner's voice telling his son to proceed to open the body. There was silence for a few seconds, and then they all started shouting phrases in another language. I can't explain how tense the place felt. An inexplicable feeling of tension combined with bad energy and anguish. When I really couldn't take it anymore, that's when I started to hear the voice of a young woman saying all sorts of nonsensical things and laughing hysterically. And suddenly, I heard the owner's son say, "I did it, Father. I made the body talk." And another man responded, "It's not the body that speaks. It's our Lord manifesting through it." That's when I understood they were performing some sort of dark ritual using one of the morgue bodies. I left there as quietly as I could, sneaking out at full speed and trembling with fear because I don't know what might have happened if they had seen me. I don't even know how I made it home that night. I was so terrified that I nearly crashed several times. I didn't know what to do or who to tell because I lived alone in that city. I had left my home precisely to find a good job, but I didn't know if I could continue there. I also didn't know if I should tell my friend who had recommended that place to me, as I didn't know if she was also aware of what was going on and might betray me. At that point, I no longer knew who to trust, so the next day I didn't show up for work. I sent an email to the owner, apologizing and explaining that my mother was very ill and I had to return to my hometown. I told him it wasn't necessary to pay me and that I sincerely apologized. I don't know if that raised any suspicions, though there was no evidence that I was there when they did that because I knew the back security camera wasn't working at the time, and the front camera didn't catch me because I parked around the corner. So even though I knew it was impossible for them to suspect me, I was very scared and paranoid. After that, I moved to another place to work. Years passed since that incident, and one day my friend, the one who had helped me get that job, called me, telling me what had happened with that man and his business. She told me that many families had sued him because they found out that their relatives' bodies were missing organs. The man was being hunted down, and they closed the business while the investigations were ongoing. To this day, I've kept all of that inside, hidden out of fear. But now that man is in jail, I feel more comfortable sharing it, though I know there were many more accomplices who are still out there.